Hi, my name is Chapin. I'm founder and director of Creeducate Consulting, and we help thousands of researchers in Europe and Asia put together clinical trials that are likely to be regarded as new and useful by highly ranked research journals. Now, scientists trying to do clinical trials face a lot of the same challenges and so end up making a lot of the same mistakes. To help you avoid some of those mistakes, we've put together just a few best practices when you're designing a clinical trial. We've spread these over three parts. The first part starts at the beginning, choosing the right question. If you don't have a research question that your trial is trying to answer, then you're in trouble. If that journal where you're trying to publish your work doesn't consider your research question new and useful, you have a problem. Now, it may seem obvious to say, but it's important to keep in mind that your research question that you're trying to address in your trial should be something that hasn't been done before, or at least that the big people in the field don't think has been done before. And so even though this seems obvious, we have a lot of clients who have problems with editors and reviewers who say, we already have data on this. Why are you doing another trial on this question? Let me give an example of how people can miss the boat on this point. This figure comes from a survey of studies on the outcomes of patients who undergo surgery involving tranexamic acid. Tranexamic acid is something very often used to control bleeding in surgery. And so many studies, starting from 1990, have been looking at whether using tranexamic acid reduces, for example, the need for blood transfusion, reduces risk of myocardial infarction, reduces risk of death. And so we've had studies asking almost the same questions from 1990 on. So for the last, 30 some years. And what you see is that almost all the studies that have been done have had sufficiently large patient samples and have been well defined and designed to address whether tranexamic acid reduces the need for blood transfusion. And so you see that there's a tremendous consensus. Yes, tranexamic acid does reduce the need for blood transfusion. However, despite these 30 years worth of studies, we still really don't know whether tranexamic acid has any effect on risk of myocardial infarction or even death. Because the studies over those 30 years, maybe they weren't sufficiently powered to look at those outcomes, maybe they didn't include long enough follow-up to look at those outcomes. Whatever the reason, we have a real problem of what many call research waste in this field. So imagine you're a researcher who comes along in 2007 and you want to do a study on tranexamic acid, and a good journal could look at your paper and say, wait a minute, we already have many previous years worth of studies showing that tranexamic acid works for blood transfusion. What are you going to do that's new? Unless you design your clinical trial appropriately to address these outcomes that still are unknown, you could have a hard time publishing your work. So here's a classic example where researchers have missed the boat. They haven't actually designed studies that respond to urgent needs of the field. Let's look at another example, this time from skin research. So this figure comes from a sort of a review looking at the research field on eczema treatments. And they do a kind of network analysis where they look at in comparison studies that have been comparing one eczema treatment with another or one eczema treatment against placebo. What does the literature hold? And what you see is these very thick lines showing, for example, many studies have compared tacrolimus with vehicle, or pimecrolimus with vehicle. But very few studies have compared, for example, a very potent TCS with occlusion or occlusion and vehicle, or certain antimicrobials with tacrolimus. There are, in this landscape of possible eczema treatments, only a handful of comparisons have been made, so that we still don't know, after decades of eczema research, we still don't know how most eczema treatments stack up against most other eczema treatments. And the authors of that review of the literature concluded clinicians should ask, before they do their trial, how many vehicle-controlled studies have actually been done? Maybe we don't need to compare our drug against vehicle. We should compare it against some of these drugs that have been neglected in comparative studies. And the authors further conclude ethical committees, if they're going to allow studies at their medical center, they should say, you know what, this study is maybe not ethically justified because you are covering ground that has already been covered a lot. So if you look closely, you can see plenty of examples where clinical trials have not been designed to really answer what are the burning needs in the field. The more you can do this in your trial, the more likely you are to be successful with those high-profile journals. You can read more about this, by the way, in a whole series run by The Lancet. It's now getting on in age. It's from 2014, but it's a special issue on research waste. You can also Google the phrase research waste and pull up a lot of other studies, including from fields other than clinical trials, where people discuss how studies are repetitive, they're not doing new enough work. You can also come across projects where people have tried to reproduce key studies and have difficulties. So there are plenty of chances for you, if you really think properly and do the right background research, there are plenty of chances for you to design a study that's going to answer what big people in the field regard as truly a burning, urgent question in the field. Let's look at clinical trials in China, for example. Now, the number of clinical trials in China is growing tremendously, as is the volume of research in general in the country. So if you look here at the number of studies that have been, clinical trials specifically, that have been registered in Chinese national registries, as well as the US-based registry and others, you see that the number is really growing. Now, however, despite this large increase in the volume of clinical trials in China, we still have a strong deficit in trials that are looking at these disorders here that you can see listed. Now, this is problematic because populations in China, as elsewhere in the world, are severely affected by these disorders. And yet, we have a shortage of such trials in China, which means that most of the research on these diseases is coming, for example, from Europe, in patient cohorts that are predominantly Caucasian. And so if you're trying to work towards personalized medicine, if you're trying to work on diseases where genetics plays a role, you could have issues. So if you do your homework properly, you could see these kinds of deficits and say, all right, if we want a good journal to be attracted to what we're doing, we need to make sure to hit these areas that have been neglected in the field. Because by addressing things that have been neglected in the field, you're more likely to stand out. What you're trying to do really is establish a comparative advantage, something your study does that almost no other study in the literature has done. Your added value, your unique selling point. Whether that's because you use a particularly long follow-up, whether it's because you include additional markers or factors or processes, you do something that's more comprehensive, you correlate genomics with the clinical presentation, whatever it might be, that's where you need to emphasize, because probably that's where your unique selling point or your added value lies. So what you want to do is think about what is it that the journal wants to hear? What is it that your readers want to hear? And I want to suggest you to focus on three key questions. If you don't have clear answers for these questions, your trial is less likely to have the right focus, a good, strong focus, and is less likely to seem justified in the eyes of many readers. These three questions are: what is the gap your study is trying to fill? In a way, why do you need to do your study? The second is, what is your unique selling point? What are you doing that similar studies have not already done? And most of you are working in competitive areas. Other people are working on the same disease as you, they're using the same methods, they're asking a lot of the same questions. So when you do a study, you need to stand out from them. The third question is, now that you've done your study, how should future research in this area change? How should future practice in the clinic maybe change? What become, how does your study create a before and after in the field? And if it should, because that's what the better studies do. Now, when a journal is trying to consider your trial, I suggest you they're looking really in three dimensions. They're trying to figure out where your study sits in terms of usefulness for the field, in terms of novelty, and in terms of technical or methodological quality. In many decades ago, it was enough to be new. You could study something, and if you were the first, you could get into a very good journal, because we really didn't know about that. But nowadays, most journals, especially the better ones, are, I would say, even more concerned with usefulness. So you could, if you're doing a trial where you say, look, we know A and B, and it would be kind of nice to know C. So here we know C. In our study, we look at C. And the journal could say, well, you're right, we don't know about C, but C is not actually important to diagnosing the disease, treating it, whatever. So it's really not that big of an advance, and you might try a lower impact journal. Make sure that doesn't happen to you just because of your design. Look at these three dimensions and ask yourself, how do I maximize the position of my trial along all three axes? And you can maybe improve your position along the axes by adjusting your research question, maybe by increasing the sample of patients you look at, by increasing the number of outcomes you look at. Often there are really several things you can do to adjust your position. And if you do, you should do that from an early stage of your trial, almost from before recruiting anybody, probably. Another way I wanted to make the same point is with this hierarchy. In the biomedical field, there's a real hierarchy about which studies are more rigorous, with, of course, the randomized controlled trial at the very top, all the way down to cross-sectional studies, single site studies, small samples. There's an inverse correlation between the abundance of a type of study in the literature and how useful it is. So it's much cheaper and faster to do very small studies, to do observational studies, to do cross-sectional studies. But it's more useful for the field generally to do more time and effort intensive studies like longitudinal, comparative studies, randomized studies. So here again, I'm trying to emphasize that you should consider how you can design your trial in its various aspects, from the question to the outcomes to the variables to the size and type of your sample. How can you optimize those methods aspects to make sure you will be as high as possible in this hierarchy of quality, and as high as possible on those three axes that I showed you in the previous slide? So with that, I want to conclude part one of this series about choosing the right research question for your trial. Really, we've looked at choosing a lot of things at the beginning of your trial before you do much work, in order to make sure that the work you do end up doing will be attractive to good journals.